The door of the small timber house slammed shut with a crack that sounded like splitting bone, the noise swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. Clara stumbled backward, the force of the shove sending a jolt through her already aching body. She landed hard in the red dust, the worn fabric of her dress puffing up around her like a sad, wilted flower. The sun, a merciless white disk in a bleached blue sky, beat down on her head. "And don't you come back!" Jedediah's voice, thick with cheap whiskey and self-righteous fury, roared from behind the closed door. "You're a burden, girl. Nothing but a weight on a decent man's soul since the day your mother brought you under my roof. And now that she's gone, God rest her, I won't have a siren in my house, tempting me from the path of righteousness." A siren. The word was absurd. A cruel joke. Clara looked down at herself, at her plain, faded calico dress, her hands raw and chapped from lye soap and endless chores, her slender frame thin from rations that had grown smaller and smaller since her mother's fever took her 2 weeks ago. She was 19, but grief and hardship had carved years onto her face. Her only crime, it seemed, was the full curve of her lips and the swell of her bosom that the worn dress could not hide. In Jedediah's eyes, her very existence as a woman was a provocation. While her mother lived, his lecherous glances had been a secret, shameful burden. Now, with her mother cold in the ground, that same gaze had twisted into righteous accusation. He had cast her out not because she was a temptress, but because he was a weak man terrified of his own shadow. Tears welled, hot and useless, mixing with the dust on her cheeks. She had nothing. Not a coin, not a spare ribbon for her hair, not even the small, silver-backed mirror that had belonged to her mother. Jedediah had kept it all. He had thrown her out with nothing but the clothes on her back and the name he was already soiling all over the small, dusty town of Redemption. For a long while, she just sat there, the heat seeping into her bones. The house she had lived in for 10 years, the only home she'd known since her real father died, was now a fortress against her. The smell of baking bread, her bread, from the dough she'd kneaded just this morning, wafted faintly through the cracks in the timber, a final, bitter insult. Eventually, the shock gave way to a cold, sharp-edged survival instinct. She couldn't die here, in the shadow of that hateful house. Pushing herself to her feet, she brushed the rust-colored dust from her skirt and began to walk. She headed toward Redemption, the cluster of buildings a hazy mirage in the distance. Hope was a small, fragile thing, but it was all she had. Someone might need a hand. A laundress, a scullery maid, a mender, anything. Her first stop was the general store, run by a portly, whiskered man named Mr. Gable, who had always given her a piece of horehound candy when she came in with her mother. Today, his face was a closed door. "Nothing for you here, girl," he said, his eyes avoiding hers as he polished a glass jar with a grubby cloth. "Please, Mr. Gable," Clara whispered, her throat dry. "I'll work for just a bit of bread. I can sweep, stock the shelves." "Heard what your stepfather said." He cut in, his voice low. "Heard you were trouble. A woman of loose morals. Can't have that in a respectable establishment. Bad for business." The lie, so fresh and venomous, had already spread. It clung to her like the dust, a stain she couldn't wash away. Humiliation burned in her chest, hotter than the sun. She backed away without another word, the tinkling of the bell above the door sounding like a jeer. She tried the saloon next, a place she would normally never dare to approach. Perhaps they needed someone to scrub floors when the place was empty. The air that hit her as she pushed open the bat-wing doors was stale with spilled beer and sweat. A few lonely prospectors looked up from their cards, their eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. The bartender, a large man with a stained apron, just laughed. "We got all the women we need here, darling," he grunted, gesturing with his thumb toward a woman in a garish red dress who was watching Clara with hard, knowing eyes. and they're a damn sight more entertaining than you." She fled, her cheeks flaming, her stomach twisted with a hunger that was now mingled with despair. She walked the length of the town's only street, a dusty track carved between wooden storefronts. Every door was closed to her. A woman from the church, Mrs. Albright, who used to praise Clara's needlework, saw her coming and deliberately crossed the street, herding her 2 small children away as if Clara were carrying the plague. The sun climbed higher, reaching its zenith, and the heat became a physical weight. The world shimmered. Thirst was a fire in her throat. She had been walking for hours, circling the edges of the town like a lost dog, her hope shrinking with every step. She left the last of the buildings behind, heading out onto the open road that led nowhere she knew. The landscape was brutal. Red earth, cracked and barren, punctuated by skeletal sagebrush and the occasional stubborn juniper tree. The mountains in the distance were hazy, purple smudges, offering no comfort, no promise of relief. She didn't know how long she walked. Time seemed to melt, to become one long, agonizing moment of heat, dust, and the rhythmic crunch of her worn-out boots on the gravelly road. Her mind began to drift. She saw her mother's face, pale and smiling. Then Jedediah's, contorted in rage. The faces in town swam before her eyes, judging, cold, merciless. Then the sky began to change. The brilliant, hateful blue began to dull, turning a sickly yellow-brown at the horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange electricity. A low moan started in the distance, a sound that grew steadily into a roar, a dust storm. Clara had seen them before, but always from the safety of the house, watching through a glass pane as the world outside disappeared. She had never been caught in the open. Panic gave her a brief surge of adrenaline. She looked around wildly for shelter, but there was nothing. Not a rock outcropping, not a ditch, not a single tree large enough to offer any protection. The wall of dust hit her like a physical blow. It was a churning, blinding mass of sand and topsoil, a monster born of drought and wind. The world vanished. She could see nothing but the swirling brown grit. It filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth, its texture gritty and vile on her tongue. The wind tore at her, whipping her hair across her face, trying to rip the thin dress from her body. She squeezed her eyes shut, turned her back to the gale, and wrapped her arms around her head, crouching low to the ground. The roar was deafening. It was the sound of the earth itself being scoured clean. She choked, coughed, her lungs burning with every desperate gasp. Her strength, already depleted by grief, hunger, and despair, gave out completely. She felt her legs buckle, her consciousness fraying at the edges. The roaring wind became a lullaby, a terrible, final song. Her last coherent thought was a simple, bitter one. So this is how it ends. Buried in the dust. Then everything went black. Eli Stone guided the wagon with practiced hands. The reins held loosely. His horse, Bess, knew the way to redemption as well as he did, even with the world dissolving into a brown fury around them. He'd seen the storm coming, but he'd gambled he could make it to town before it hit. He'd lost. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, squinting his eyes against the stinging grit. The sacks of grain in the back were covered with a heavy tarp, but this was a devil of a storm. It had been a dry year. The whole damn country was turning to dust. He was a man who had made his peace with solitude. His ranch was a good few miles out of town, a lonely patch of land that had once held laughter and the scent of baking pies. Now, it was just quiet. It had been 2 years since Martha was taken by the fever, and the silence she'd left behind was a constant, living presence. Eli didn't fight it anymore. He lived with it, just as he lived with the heat and the dust and the back-breaking work of keeping a few dozen head of cattle alive in a land that seemed determined to kill everything. It was through a momentary thinning of the swirling dust that he saw it, a splash of color against the monotonous brown, a heap of blue fabric on the side of the road. His first thought was that it was a discarded blanket, But as the wagon drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, a woman. He cursed under his breath, a low, weary sound. Trouble. Nothing good ever came from finding people collapsed on the road. He pulled Bess to a halt, the wagon groaning in protest. He sat for a moment, the wind howling around him, half tempted to just drive on. It wasn't his business. The world was full of people meeting hard ends. He'd seen enough of it. But then he remembered Martha, her breath rattling in her chest, her hand growing cold in his. He remembered the terrible helplessness of watching someone fade away. He couldn't stop her death. But this was just a woman in the dust. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he wrapped the reins around the brake handle and jumped down from the wagon. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet. He hunched his shoulders and trudged toward the figure. She was lying face down, her dark hair a tangled mess, caked with dirt. She was young, he could tell that much, and frighteningly still. He knelt, his knees cracking, and gently rolled her over. Her face was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked and tinged with blue. He pressed 2 rough fingers against the side of her neck. He waited. For a second, he felt nothing. Then, a flutter, faint, thready, but it was there. She was alive. He looked around, back at his wagon, then at the endless, roaring dust. Leaving her here was a death sentence. Taking her to redemption was useless. The doctor was a drunk, and no one else would take in a stranger found half dead on the road. That left one option, an option he didn't much like. Without further debate, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones. He carried her to the wagon and carefully laid her in the small space between the driver's seat and the grain sacks. He pulled a worn and wool blanket from behind the seat and tucked it around her, then turned the wagon around. The grain would have to wait. He was heading home. The journey back was slow and tense. Eli focused on the road, his face a grim mask of concentration. He didn't look at the woman lying behind him. He didn't want to think about who she was or how she'd ended up there. He was just moving a problem from one place to another. His farmhouse was a simple, sturdy structure of cottonwood logs, chinked with mud. It was functional, sparse, and scrupulously clean inside. He carried her in and set her down gently on the long, padded bench that served as a settee near the hearth. The fire was banked, but a few embers still glowed. He added a few logs, and soon, small flames were licking at the wood, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. He worked with a quiet, detached efficiency. He filled a basin with water from the pump, setting it on the floor beside her, along with a bar of lye soap and a rough but clean towel. He ladled some leftover beef and vegetable stew into a bowl and placed it on a small crate next to the bench, along with a tin cup of water. He did it all without emotion, his movements economical, his face unreadable. He wasn't her savior. He was simply a man performing a series of necessary tasks. He retreated to a chair in the far corner of the room, took out his whetstone and a large hunting knife, and began to sharpen the blade. The rhythmic shk, shk, shk of steel on stone was the only sound in the room, apart from the crackling fire and the muffled howl of the wind outside. He did not watch her. He waited. Clara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and beef stew. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was home, that her mother was still alive, that the last day had been a nightmare. Then her eyes fluttered open. The ceiling was wrong. It was made of rough-hewn logs, not the familiar whitewashed plaster of her room. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. She sat up with a gasp, her muscles screaming in protest. A coarse wool blanket fell away from her shoulders. She was in a strange room, dimly lit by a fire. A man sat in the shadows across from her, the firelight glinting off the long blade of a knife he was sharpening. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been taken, abducted. Jedediah's vile accusation swirled in her head. This was it. This was the fate everyone in town assumed she was destined for. She scrambled off the bench, her legs unsteady, and backed away until she hit the cold stone of the fireplace. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, a weapon, anything. The man didn't move. He didn't even look up from his task. He just continued the steady, hypnotic scrape of steel on stone. His stillness was more unnerving than any threat. He was big, broad-shouldered, his face weathered and carved with lines that spoke of sun and hardship. He wasn't old, perhaps 35, but he looked as weary as the land outside. His clothes were plain, durable denim and flannel, clean but faded. He had the quiet, coiled stillness of a predator. Yet he made no move toward her. Her terror began to subside, replaced by a profound confusion. She noticed the basin of water, the soap, the bowl of stew. This wasn't the behavior of a kidnapper. Her eyes fell on her own hands, caked with grime. She was filthy, exhausted, and starving. Slowly, cautiously, she crept toward the bench and picked up the cup of water, her eyes never leaving him. She drank, the cool liquid a balm on her raw throat. He still didn't look up. Emboldened, she picked up the bowl of stew. It was warm. She took a hesitant spoonful. The rich, savory flavor was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She devoured the rest of it in minutes, the desperate hunger overriding everything else. When the bowl was empty, she set it down and finally found her voice. It came out as a ragged croak. Where am I?" The man stopped sharpening his knife. He wiped the blade carefully on a piece of leather and set it aside. Then, for the first time, he looked at her. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, gray and deep and filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. There was no malice in them, no lust. There was nothing but a vast, tired emptiness. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked to the door. Peering out into the darkness, the wind had died down some. "The storm's past," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough like gravel. He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. Clara braced herself, her fear returning. Now he would ask questions, now he would demand payment for his charity. But he did neither. He just looked at her, a piece of human flotsam washed up on his doorstep by a sea of dust. "I didn't save you because I'm a good man," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth. "I just didn't want to see another body buried in the dust." The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Clara awoke each morning on the settee before the sun, the coarse wool blanket a familiar weight. The man, Eli, would already be gone. The only evidence of his presence a lingering trace of coffee in the air and the faint scent of the harsh soap he used. His silence was a wall, but it was not a threatening one. After that first night, he had said little else to her, and she, in turn, did not ask the questions that burned on her tongue. "Who are you? Who was she, the woman in the silver-framed picture on the mantelpiece? Why did you help me?" She knew she couldn't stay without earning her keep. The word her stepfather had branded her with, burden, was a fresh wound, and she was determined to prove it a lie, if only to herself. She began to work. It started simply. She washed the bowl and cup from her first meal, stacking them neatly on a dry rack. She swept the packed earth floor, her broom whispering in the silence. She found a pile of his work clothes, stiff with dirt and sweat, and spent an afternoon scrubbing them on a washboard by the well until her knuckles were raw, hanging them on a line to snap and dance in the relentless wind. Eli never acknowledged her efforts with words. When he returned at dusk, caked in the same red dust that had nearly been her grave, he would simply nod, his gray eyes sweeping over the tidy cabin, the simmering pot on the stove, the mended tear in his shirt. He would eat the simple meal she prepared, usually some variation of beans, bacon, and the hard biscuits she learned to make from his limited pantry, and then retreat to his chair, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of tack. He never thanked her, but he never stopped her, either. His silence was her permission to stay. Life with him was a study in quietude and profound, solitary grief. Clara learned the contours of his sorrow not through words, but through observation. Some nights, she would be jolted from a light sleep by the sound of the floorboards creaking. Peeking through her lashes, she would see his silhouette by the window, a statue staring out at the moon-drenched plains, sleepless and rigid with a tension that seemed to vibrate in the still air. His gaze was often drawn to the mantelpiece, to the small, tarnished silver frame that held the image of a smiling, fair-haired woman, a daguerreotype, its subjects frozen in a ghostly, metallic sheen. The woman was beautiful, her eyes full of a light that seemed to mock the perpetual twilight in Eli's. He would stare at the picture for long stretches, his face a mask of granite. But Clara could see the flicker of agony in his eyes, a deep, unhealed wound. This was Martha. The name was not spoken, but Clara knew it as surely as she knew her own. The entire cabin was a shrine to her absence. Every clean plate, every neatly folded blanket, seemed to cry out for the one who was no longer there to see it. Clara felt like a ghost haunting another ghost's house. She was careful not to disturb anything, to make her presence as small and unobtrusive as possible, all while her own grief for her mother churned inside her, a sorrow she had no space or permission to express. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive quiet of the cabin, Clara wandered behind the house. There, choked by thorny weeds and sun-scorched earth, was the ghost of a garden. A few gnarled, skeletal tomato vines clung to rotting stakes. A patch of what might have once been squash was now a tangle of withered leaves and stems. The earth was cracked and hard as stone. It was a place of neglect, a mirror of the sorrow that permeated the homestead. Something shifted in Clara. It was a flicker of defiance, a refusal to let everything beautiful be consumed by dust and despair. Here was something she could fix. Here was something she could bring back to life. She found a rusty spade and a hoe in the lean-to shed. The work was brutal. The ground fought her, refusing to yield. Her hands, already chapped, blistered and then bled. The sun beat down on her back, and sweat stung her eyes, but she did not stop. For hours each day, she battled the earth. She pulled weeds until her arms ached, their roots clinging stubbornly to the soil. She hacked at the hardpan with the hoe, breaking it up into smaller and smaller clods. She hauled buckets of water from the well, a back-breaking journey she made over and over again, her steps slow and measured. Eli watched her from a distance, his face unreadable as he returned from the range. He said nothing, but one evening, she found the broken handle of the spade had been replaced with a new one, smooth and sturdy, carved from ash. The next day, a small tin of seeds appeared on the porch railing, beans, corn, and squash. There was no note, none was needed. Slowly, miraculously, the patch of dead earth began to transform. Clara coaxed green shoots from the soil. The neat rows she planted were an act of faith in a faithless land. The work grounded her, exhausting her body so her mind had less room for the looping reel of her grief and fear. In tending the garden, she was tending to the broken pieces of herself. The small plot of green became her sanctuary, a testament to the stubborn, irrational persistence of life. The desolate landscape around the farm suddenly had a small, vibrant heart, and it was one she had created. But some pains could not be sweated out under the sun or buried in the soil. One evening, after a particularly hard day, the weight of it all came crashing down. She had finished her chores and stepped outside to stack the firewood Eli had chopped. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The beauty of it was an agony, a reminder of all she had lost. Her mother had loved the sunsets. The thought was a key turning a lock in her heart, and everything she had held back, the grief, the humiliation, the terror of her absolute aloneness, came pouring out. She sank down onto the woodpile, burying her face in her hands, and wept. Not quiet, dignified tears, but great, gulping, body-shaking sobs that tore from her throat. She cried for her mother's wasted life and painful death. She cried for her own stolen youth. She cried for the simple fact that there was no one in the world to call her name with love. She was so lost in her misery that she didn't hear the soft crunch of his boots on the gravel behind her. She felt it before she saw it, a sudden warmth, a solid weight on her shoulder. She flinched, her head snapping up. Eli stood over her, his large, calloused hand resting gently on her. His face, illuminated by the dying light, was filled with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. He said nothing. He didn't offer clumsy words of comfort or ask what was wrong. He simply stood there, his hand on her shoulder, a silent, unmoving anchor in her storm of grief. The weight of his hand was a strange comfort, real, solid, a connection to another human being. It was the first gentle touch she had known in years. She slowly quieted, her sobs subsiding into ragged breaths. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures in the vast twilight, as the stars began to prick the darkening sky. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a shared space, a vessel that held both of their unspoken pains. When he finally removed his hand and walked back into the house, the night air felt cold where he had touched her. The next morning, Clara woke with a new sense of purpose. Something had shifted between them in the twilight by the woodpile. A fragile bridge had been built in that silence. She found the flour sack, her hands moving with a memory that came from watching her mother 1,000 times. She mixed the dough, her movements sure and steady. She kneaded it on the floured tabletop, pushing and folding, pouring her swirling emotions into the task. Soon, the scent of baking bread, warm, yeasty, and deeply comforting, began to fill the small cabin. It was a smell of life, of nourishment, of home. It pushed back against the stale scent of sorrow that clung to the log walls. It was an audacious act of domesticity in a house that had become little more than a shelter. Eli came in from the barn, stopping just inside the doorway. He sniffed the air, and for the first time, Clara saw something other than grief or weariness on his face. It was surprise. He watched her pull the 2 golden brown loaves from the small oven built into the hearth. She placed them on a cloth to cool, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She cut a thick slice for him, a silent offering, and put it on a plate next to his morning coffee. He picked it up, turned it over in his rough hands, and took a bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes distant. Clara held her breath. He swallowed, then looked around the small room, at the sunlight streaming through the clean window pane, at the faint haze of flour still hanging in the air. "It tastes warm," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "The whole house smells warm. It's a smell I thought this house had forgotten." He didn't say Martha's name. He didn't have to. The words hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of what had been lost, and a tentative recognition of what was now here. He was admitting that her presence had changed the very air he breathed. He finished the slice of bread in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The tension that had defined their cohabitation had not vanished, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer the tense, wary silence of 2 strangers sharing a roof. Now, it was charged with a new awareness, a dangerous curiosity. When his fingers brushed against hers as he reached for the coffee pot, a jolt passed between them, sudden and sharp. They both pulled back as if burned. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that glance, a world of unspoken things was communicated: fear, loneliness, and the terrifying, fragile flicker of a feeling neither of them was ready to name. The fragile peace they had built, woven from silent mornings and shared, wordless tasks, was shattered by the sound of an approaching horse. It was a Tuesday, hot and still, the air thick with the promise of a long, dry summer. Clara was on her knees in her garden, her hands deep in the dark, rich earth she had so painstakingly cultivated. Eli was near the barn, repairing a harness, the rhythmic tap of his hammer a familiar, comforting sound. The intrusion of a visitor was so unusual it felt like a violation. A heavy-set man in a dusty coat, his badge of office catching the noon sun, dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. Clara recognized him as Deputy Miller, a man whose piety was as loud as his appetite was large. He stomped onto the porch, his boots echoing with an unearned authority. Eli straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. He walked to meet the man, his body language a study in unwelcoming stillness. He didn't invite the deputy inside. "Stone," the deputy said, nodding curtly. He took off his hat and wiped a sleeve across his sweating brow, his eyes darting past Eli to where Clara was frozen in the garden, a clod of earth crumbling in her hand. "Got some official business?" Eli just waited, his gray eyes as hard and flat as river stones. "Word from town," Miller continued, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial boom. "Jedediah Croft came to see the sheriff yesterday. Filed a complaint. Says his stepdaughter, Clara, well, he says she run off with his savings, a whole month's wages. He says she stole it right from the lockbox he kept under his bed." The lie was so audacious, so vile, that it stole the air from Clara's lungs. She felt the blood drain from her face, from her place in the garden. She was a spectator to her own condemnation. "Jedediah's looking to have her brought back," Miller said, his gaze lingering on Clara with a smug, knowing look. "Sheriff put the word out. She's a wanted thief." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. "I heard whispers a woman matching her description was seen out this way, just doing my duty, Stone, letting folks know to be on the lookout for a runaway and a thief." Eli's expression didn't flicker. He didn't look at Clara. He looked straight through the deputy as if he were a pane of dirty glass. "I've seen no one," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I'm a busy man. Miller, I don't have time for town gossip." The dismissal was absolute. The deputy's face reddened. "This ain't gossip. It's the law, if you're harboring a fugitive." "Are you accusing me of something?" Eli's voice dropped even lower, and for the first time, a dangerous edge crept into it. Deputy Miller, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He shuffled his feet and jammed his hat back on his head. No, of course not. Stone, just making my rounds. You have a good day." He turned and practically fled, untying his horse with fumbling fingers and kicking it into a hasty trot down the path, leaving a cloud of dust and poisonous silence in his wake. The silence that followed was worse than the accusation itself. The rhythmic tap of the hammer did not resume. Clara remained on her knees, the sun beating down on her head, her body trembling. He hadn't defended her. He had simply denied her existence, in the eyes of the law, and in his words. She was no one. Not even here. Humiliation, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She waited for him to yell, to tell her to get out, to curse her for bringing trouble to his door. But he did nothing. He stood by the barn for a long time, his back to her. Then he turned and walked, not to her, but into the dim coolness of the barn. Clara's heart sank. This was it. He was giving her time to pack the nothing she owned and disappear before he had to throw her out himself. She forced her shaking legs to stand. She walked back to the cabin, her mind a numb buzz of despair. Where would she go? Jedediah had made sure there was nowhere left. She was truly, finally, without hope. She was standing in the middle of the room, her hands twisted in her apron, when Eli finally came in. He didn't look at her. He went to the water bucket, took a long drink from the dipper, and splashed some water on his face. He moved with a deliberate slowness that stretched her nerves to the breaking point. Finally, he turned to her. His face was impassive, his eyes holding no sympathy, only a hard, practical light. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. The question, so simple, so devoid of emotion, was what finally broke her. It wasn't an offer to stay. It was a logistical inquiry. He was asking her if she intended to become his problem or someone else's. All the terror, the grief, the injustice, the crushing weight of her mother's silent complicity came rushing to the surface in a tidal wave. A sob tore from her chest, a raw, animal sound of pure anguish. "Leave?" she choked out, tears streaming down her face. "Where would I go? He's told everyone I'm a thief. He called me a harlot before that. There is nowhere." She sank onto the bench by the hearth, the same bench where he had first laid her, and the whole story came pouring out, a chaotic, painful flood. She told him everything, the words tumbling over each other in her haste to expel the poison she'd held inside for so long. He never laid a hand on me while my mother was well." She wept, her voice cracking. "But his eyes, after she got sick, his eyes were everywhere. On my arms when I'd knead the bread, on my chest when I'd stoop to tend the fire. He'd find reasons to be near me, to brush against me in the narrow hall. He said things, vile things, that my body was a snare for righteous men, that I was a wanton woman, born of sin." She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears, desperate for him to understand. "I am not beautiful. I am just built like my mother. But he made me feel like my own skin was a crime. He made me hate myself. And my mother." Her voice broke completely. She saw it. I know she saw it. I would see her watching from her bed, and when I looked at her, she would just turn her face to the wall. She was sick, and she was afraid of him, and she said nothing. She let him do it. She let him look at me like that, talk to me like that. She chose her peace over me. The confession of that ultimate betrayal was the most painful of all. It was the wound beneath all the others. She had not only lost her mother to a fever, she had lost her long before, to fear. "When she died," Clara whispered, wrapping her arms around herself, "he said I was a burden he wouldn't carry. He said I'd tried to tempt him. The money, there was no money. He knows that. He just wants to ruin me. He wants to make sure no one will ever help me, that I have to go crawling back to him. And then—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Throughout her torrent of words, Eli stood as still as a mountain. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't offer a single word of comfort. He just listened, his gray eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. She expected disgust or disbelief, or perhaps even pity. She received none of them. He simply absorbed her story, his silence a vast, empty space, when she had cried herself into a raw, hiccuping silence. He turned without a word and left the cabin. Despair washed over her. He believed the deputy. He was leaving her to her fate. She listened for the sound of him riding away, but there was only the chirping of crickets and the lowing of a distant cow. A few minutes later, he returned. He was carrying something heavy and metallic. He walked over to her and dropped it on the floor in front of her with a loud clang. It was the broken share of a plow. Its iron tip snapped clean off. It was a useless, ruined thing. Clara stared at it, then up at him, her tear-stained face a mask of confusion. He looked down at her, his gaze direct and hard, stripping away all sentiment. "You can stay," he said. His voice was flat, a statement of fact, not an act of kindness. "But the rules are different now. This isn't a charity. That man, Miller, he'll be back. Others will come snooping. From now on, you work like a man. You eat like a man. You will mend what is broken, and you will pull your own weight and then some. No one here belongs to anyone. You are not mine to protect, and I am not yours to own. You are simply here. Is that understood?" It was the harshest offer of sanctuary she could have imagined. He wasn't offering comfort, or kindness, or even belief. He was offering a contract. He was giving her a chance to work herself to the bone in exchange for a roof over her head. He was offering her survival. Nothing more. But survival was everything. "Yes," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I understand." He nodded once, then turned and walked out, leaving her alone with the broken plowshare at her feet. That night, sleep would not come. She lay on the settee, listening to the sound of Eli's restless turning in the other room. She was safe. For now. She had been allowed to stay. But the coldness of the arrangement chilled her to the bone. She felt a profound and terrible loneliness. She had been accepted as a pair of hands, a body to perform labor, another piece of livestock on the farm. She had poured out the deepest, most painful secrets of her soul, and in return, he had handed her a broken tool and a list of rules. She turned her face into the rough blanket, and for the second time that day, she cried. But these were different tears. They were not tears of fear or rage, but of a quiet, aching sorrow for a love and tenderness she was beginning to believe she would never know. The weeks that followed were filled with grueling work. Eli was true to his word. He worked her as hard as he worked himself. She was up before dawn, milking the lone cow and feeding the chickens, and she worked until long after dusk, mending clothes by lamplight until her eyes burned. He taught her to mend fences, to split firewood, to wield a hammer without hitting her own thumb. Her hands, already calloused, grew tough as leather. Her body ached with a deep, satisfying exhaustion. There was no time for tears. They spoke little, but they worked together, moving in a rhythm of shared labor. And in that rhythm, something began to change. One hot, breathless evening in late summer, a section of the fence on the far pasture gave way. A storm was threatening, and the cattle could not be allowed to wander. They went out together after a hasty supper, carrying tools and a lantern, though the full moon rising over the plains provided a ghostly, silver light. The air was thick and still, buzzing with the sound of insects. They worked in silence, their movements efficient and synchronized. He would hold the post steady while she hammered the wire into place. The moonlight softened the hard lines of his face, making him look younger, less weary. She reached for a staple from the pouch at his belt at the same moment he did. Their hands collided in the small leather bag. It was an accident, a simple, clumsy moment. But then, it wasn't. His fingers closed over hers. His hand was rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. For a long second that stretched into an eternity, neither of them moved. They stood frozen under the silver moon, his hand covering hers, the world shrinking to that single point of contact. She could feel the steady, powerful pulse in his wrist. She looked up at him, and his eyes, dark pools in the moonlight, were fixed on her, filled with a raw, startled expression she had never seen before. It was not anger or grief. It was something else. Something wild and vulnerable and just as frightened as she was. He was the one who broke the spell. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, his breath catching in a ragged hiss. He stood up abruptly, turning his back to her. "I'll finish here," he said, his voice strained and harsh. "Go on back to the house." He walked away without another word, his broad shoulders stiff, leaving her alone in the moonlight. Clara stood perfectly still, her hand still tingling, her fingers curled into her palm as if to hold on to the warmth he'd left behind. She watched him go, a tall, lonely figure moving through the tall grass, and she realized, with a sudden, heart-stopping clarity, that something inside her had irrevocably shifted. Her heart was no longer just beating to survive. It was hammering against her ribs with a new, terrifying, and utterly undeniable rhythm. It was beating for him. The moon from that night seemed to hang in the sky for weeks, a silent witness to the new, fragile tension that hummed between them. The touch of their hands had been a spark in a tinder dry landscape, and now they moved around each other with a cautious awareness, careful not to let it ignite. But the world around them was already burning. The drought, which had been a quiet threat, now became an insatiable monster. The sky remained a vast, empty bowl of searing blue. Day after merciless day. The creek that cut through Eli's land shrank from a gurgling stream to a string of muddy pools, then to cracked, sun-baked earth. The grass in the pasture turned from green to gold, then to a brittle, lifeless brown. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint. Clara's garden, her small patch of defiance, became a daily battleground. She hauled endless buckets of water, her shoulders aching, her back screaming, her hands raw, just to keep the squash from withering on the vine. Their shared struggle became the new language between them. Words were unnecessary when their days were a punishing litany of shared tasks. They worked from the first hint of gray light until long after the sun had bled out across the horizon. They rode out together, searching for patches of grays the sun had somehow missed. They dug at the dry creek bed, deepening a pool to catch what little moisture remained. The work was a crucible, burning away everything but the essential. In their shared exhaustion, a new kind of intimacy was forged, the profound, unspoken bond of two people fighting the same relentless enemy. It was during this time that Eli began to teach her. The lessons were born of necessity. "It's not enough to mend a fence," he stated one evening, his voice flat as he watched her struggle to lift a heavy saddle. "This land can kill you in 100 different ways. You need to be able to run from it if you have to." He taught her to ride. Her first horse was an old, placid mare named Daisy, whose primary ambition was to stand still. Clara was terrified. The animal was a massive, unpredictable creature, and her body, so accustomed to having its feet on the solid ground, protested at being lifted so high. "Stop holding on like you're strangling a chicken." Eli's voice grumbled from below. "Let the horse do the work. Feel its rhythm." His instruction was gruff, impatient, but his hands were surprisingly gentle as he adjusted her feet in the stirrups, his fingers brushing her ankle, sending another one of those unnerving jolts through her. Day after day, he made her ride, first at a walk, then a trot that jarred her bones and stole her breath. She fell twice, landing hard in the dust, the humiliation stinging more than the bruises. Both times. He was there before she could even register what had happened, his strong hands pulling her to her feet, his face a mask of grim concern. "Again," was all he would say, and slowly, she learned. She learned the feel of the horse moving beneath her, the subtle shift of weight that communicated her commands. She learned to trust the animal, and in doing so, she learned to trust herself. One afternoon, she urged Daisy into a canter, and for a few glorious moments, they flew across the parched plain, the wind whipping her hair back, a feeling of exhilarating freedom washing over her. When she finally pulled the mare to a stop, her heart pounding, she saw Eli watching from the corral fence. He wasn't smiling, but there was a faint glint of something in his eyes. Respect. The second lesson was more serious. He brought out a heavy Winchester rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth, its barrel a dull, deadly gray. He laid it in her hands. The weight of it shocked her. It was a tool of death, cold and purposeful. "You're a woman alone on a remote ranch," he said, his voice devoid of any softness. "Trouble finds places like this. Jedediah isn't the only kind of snake in this country. You need to know how to use this." He showed her how to load it, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. He stood behind her, his body close but not touching, his voice a low rumble by her ear. "Brace it against your shoulder, firm. It's going to kick." The first time she fired, the explosion was deafening, the kick a violent shove that knocked her back a step and left a throbbing ache in her shoulder. The bullet went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet from the tin can he'd set on a fence post. "Again," he said. She fired again and again. Her shoulder throbbed, her ears rang, but she began to get the feel of it, the cold, hard logic of the machine. On her 5th shot, The tin can jumped into the air with a satisfying ping. A slow smile spread across her face. She looked back at Eli. He simply nodded, his face grim. "Good," he said. "Now do it again." He was giving her the tools of survival, but it was more than that. He was giving her his trust. He was treating her not as a woman to be sheltered, but as a partner to be armed. They were two souls against the wilderness, and he was making sure she could hold her own. The bond between them deepened, cemented by shared labor and mutual respect. The memory of their hands touching in the moonlight was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their days, an unanswered question they were both too afraid to ask. The accident happened on a blistering afternoon. They were trying to move a small group of cattle from one barren pasture to another when a large rattlesnake, coiled in the scant shade of a sagebrush, struck out at Eli's horse. The horse, a spirited gelding named Rebel, screamed and reared violently. Eli, a master horseman, stayed in the saddle, but as the horse came down, it bucked and kicked out, its powerful hind leg catching Eli squarely on his left shin. Clara heard the sickening crack of bone over the horse's frantic whinnying. She saw Eli fall, his body hitting the hard-packed earth with a heavy thud. For a moment, the world stopped. Then, adrenaline surged through her. She galloped Daisy over to him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. He was trying to push himself up, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his jaw clenched against a wave of pain. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle below the knee. "It's broken," he gritted out, the words tight with agony. In that moment, their roles were completely reversed. The strong, capable man who had rescued her from the dust was now helpless, his body broken. The frightened girl he had found was gone. In her place was a woman who knew what needed to be done. Getting him back to the cabin was a nightmare. She had to get him onto Rebel's back, a feat of leverage and sheer willpower that left them both shaking and drenched in sweat. Every step the horse took sent a fresh wave of agony through him, and she could see him fighting to stay conscious. She walked beside him, one hand on his good leg to steady him, the other on the reins, her voice a low, steady murmur of encouragement. Inside the cabin, she helped him onto his bed. The first time she had ever set foot in his room, it was as sparse and clean as the rest of the house, dominated by a simple wooden bed frame and a single, haunting photograph of Martha on the nightstand. She cut away his pant leg with a knife. The sight of the injury made her stomach lurch. The bone had broken cleanly, but the flesh was already swelling, a grotesque, purplish bruise spreading across his skin. She worked with a frantic, focused energy. She remembered watching her mother set a neighbor's broken arm once. She found 2 sturdy pieces of wood from the kindling box and tore strips from a clean bedsheet. Gritting her teeth, she pulled on his leg, a terrible, low groan tearing from Eli's throat as she forced the bone into alignment. She splinted it as tightly as she could, her movements clumsy but firm. He passed out from the pain. For the next 2 days, Clara was a whirlwind of motion. She did everything. She milked the cow, fed the animals, hauled the water, and tended to Eli. He was mostly lucid, his pain a constant, grim presence in the room. He would direct her with short, clipped sentences, telling her which feed to use, which gate to check. She listened and obeyed, her exhaustion a dull ache that settled deep in her bones. On the 3rd night, the fever started. His skin, which had been clammy and cool, became hot and dry to the touch. The leg, below the splint, was red and angry-looking. Infection, her deepest fear realized. They were miles from town. And Dr. Miller was more likely to be found at the bottom of a bottle than at a patient's bedside. She was on her own. A new, more desperate fight began. She kept a constant vigil, leaving his side only for the most essential chores. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, trying to bring the fever down. She brewed a bitter tea from willow bark, something an old native woman had once shown her mother, and forced the liquid between his cracked lips. He began to drift, his mind lost in the fever's fog. He tossed and turned, muttering things she couldn't understand. She was dozing in the chair beside his bed, her head nodding with exhaustion, when she heard him say the name, a clear, desperate whisper in the quiet room. Martha. Clara's eyes snapped open, her heart constricted into a small, cold knot. Martha, the water, he murmured, his eyes closed, his head thrashing on the pillow. It's so hot. We need to get the water to the south pasture. He was reliving a memory, a day from his past, and he thought Clara was his wife. She felt a pain so sharp and profound it was like a physical blow. All her work, all her care, all the fragile bonds they had built. In his mind, it was all for another woman. She was a ghost, a stand-in, a faceless pair of hands belonging to the woman he had truly loved. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and bitter. She wanted to run, to leave him there with his memories, but she looked at his fever-flushed face, at the sheen of sweat on his brow, and she couldn't. He was sick. He needed her, whoever he thought she was. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she dipped a cloth in the cool water and gently wiped his forehead. "Hush now, Eli," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The water is fine. Just rest." For 2 more days, she was Martha. He would speak to his dead wife through her, his words a jumble of shared memories, old arguments, and tender endearments that stabbed Clara with a fresh pang of grief each time. She listened, she soothed, and she worked, all while her own heart was quietly breaking. On the 5th night, the fever broke. He fell into a deep, natural sleep, his breathing evening out, his skin finally cool to the touch. Clara, utterly spent, collapsed into the chair and slept, too, a deep, dreamless sleep of pure exhaustion. She awoke to the feeling of being watched. She opened her eyes to find Eli awake, his gaze clear and lucid for the first time in days. He was looking at her, not with the fever's confusion, but with a raw, unguarded intensity that made her breath catch. He looked at her rumpled dress, the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness etched into her face, and he seemed to see it all. He was weak, but he lifted his hand, his fingers brushing against her arm. She didn't pull away. His voice was a dry, raspy whisper. "You saved my life." She just shook her head, unable to speak. He held her gaze, his gray eyes searching hers. "I hurt myself," he whispered, a look of deep shame on his face. "In the fever, I called you by her name." Clara looked down at her lap, the pain of it returning. "It's all right," she mumbled. "You were sick." "No," he said, his voice gaining a fraction of its strength. His fingers tightened on her arm, not letting her look away. "Look at me, Clara." She slowly lifted her eyes to his. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Every night for 2 years, I've dreamed of her. Every single night. It was like she was still here, walking through this house, sleeping in this bed, but—" He paused, his throat working. "I don't dream of her anymore. Not for a long time now. Not since you've been here." The confession hung in the quiet room, a fragile, momentous thing. He was letting her go. He was letting Martha go. He was seeing her, Clara, sitting in the chair beside him. The air grew thick with unspoken emotions. Gratitude, relief, a terrifying and undeniable current of desire. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on his face. He tugged gently on her arm, pulling her closer to the bed. She went without resisting, her body moving as if in a dream. She knelt by the bedside, their faces inches apart. He lifted his other hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Clara," he breathed, and then he kissed her. It was nothing like she could have imagined. It was not a gentle, tender kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of 2 lonely, wounded people who had found an anchor in a storm. It was rough and deep, full of the pent-up longing of the past weeks. full of his gratitude and her relief, full of a fierce, possessive hunger that stunned them both. She kissed him back with equal fire, her hands coming up to clutch his shoulders, pouring all of her fear and loneliness and burgeoning love into the act. But then, the ghost of Martha rose between them, the memory of him calling her name, the fear that she was nothing more than a warm body to replace a cold one. It was a splash of icy water on the fire. She pulled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her lips tingling. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can't." His eyes were dark with confusion and hurt. "What is it?" "I don't want to be another ghost in your heart, Eli," she said, the words tumbling out, raw and painful. "I don't want to be a comfort you used to forget your wife. I won't be her shadow." He stared at her, the firelight flickering in his eyes. He didn't deny it, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply looked at her, at the woman who had fought for his life, the woman who had brought life back to his fallow garden, the woman who had met his harshness with a quiet, unbreakable strength. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. "You're not a ghost, Clara," he said, his voice a low, rumbling certainty. She was the ghost. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch sending a shiver through her. You're fire." Eli's words had changed the air in the cabin, but they had not changed the space. "Fire," he had called her, and the name echoed in the quiet moments. A truth that both warmed and terrified her. In the weeks that followed, as his leg healed from an angry wound to a puckered scar, a new and delicate domesticity settled over them. They were a pair of dancers learning a complex new step, moving around a central, unspoken gravity. They lived as man and wife in every way but the most essential. They shared their meals across the small wooden table, his knee sometimes brushing against hers, sending a now familiar jolt through her veins. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. He had come to rely on her strength, and she on his steady presence. The hard line of his mouth would sometimes soften when she brought him a cool dipper of water in the field, and his stormy gray eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin in the evenings, a look of quiet, wondering possession in them. But the boundary remained. Each night, she would spread her blankets on the settee by the hearth, and he would retreat to his cold, empty bed. The cabin, which had once felt vast and lonely, now seemed impossibly small, thick with a tension that was almost a physical presence. They were two stars orbiting each other, held in place by a powerful, invisible force, terrified of the cataclysm that would occur if they were to finally collide. Clara lay awake many nights, her body humming with a strange, aching energy, listening to the sound of his restless turning in the other room, wondering how long they could continue this charade. The drought held its grip on the land, and their supplies began to dwindle. The day came when a trip to town was no longer a choice, but a necessity. Redemption was holding its quarterly market fair, and they needed flour, salt, coffee, and a new axe head. Eli announced it at breakfast, his voice carefully neutral. "We'll go into town today." He said, "Way," and the simple words sent a flutter of both excitement and dread through Clara's heart. It was the first time they would venture into the world together, away from the isolated sanctuary of the farm. She put on her best dress, a simple gray cotton frock she had sewn herself from a bolt of fabric Eli had bought for her from a traveling peddler. She brushed her dark hair until it shone and pinned it up carefully, wanting, for some foolish reason, to look respectable, to look like she belonged with him. The town of Redemption was a chaotic swirl of noise and people. Farmers and ranchers had come from miles around. The dusty main street was crowded with wagons, horses, and boisterous children. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, frying sausages, and cheap perfume. After the profound quiet of the farm, the sensory assault was overwhelming. Clara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she sat beside Eli on the wagon seat. She saw whispers pass between women as they walked by. She saw Mr. Gable, the proprietor of the general store, stare at her from his doorway, his face a mask of smug disapproval. Jedediah's poison had seeped deep into the town's well, and the water was still tainted. She was the runaway, the thief, the fallen woman living in sin with the town's most solitary widower. She held her head high, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. But inside, she was shrinking. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up her neck and burned her cheeks. She felt exposed, judged, and utterly alone. Eli seemed oblivious. He moved through the crowd with a grim, purposeful stride, his face a granite wall. He nodded curtly to the men he knew, but he offered no introductions, no explanations. He didn't take her arm or walk possessively beside her. He simply existed near her, a separate, solitary entity. To the watching eyes of the town, his silence was a damning indictment. He wasn't claiming her. He was tolerating her. He was ashamed. The thought, once it took root, was a bitter weed that choked out everything else. Every curious glance, every hushed comment became a fresh cut when she saw Mrs. Albright, the pious woman from the church, pull her children away as they approached. The wound deepened. She had thought, in the crucible of the drought and the intimacy of Eli's sickness, that she had been forged into someone new, someone strong. But here, in the town that had cast her out, she was the same worthless, shamed creature she had been the day she'd collapsed in the dust. The ride home was a long, suffocating silence. The sun beat down, and the sacks of supplies in the back of the wagon felt like a horde of stolen goods. Clara stared straight ahead, the scenery a blur through her unshed tears of fury and humiliation. She had faced down death, rebuilt a garden from dust, and nursed a man back from the brink. She would not be undone by the petty cruelties of small-minded people. But it wasn't the town she was angry with. It was the man sitting beside her. Finally, she could bear it no longer. The wagon wheel hit a rock, jarring her, and the fragile dam of her control broke. "Are you ashamed of me?" The words were quiet, but they sliced through the air like a razor. Eli kept his eyes on the road. "Don't be foolish." "Foolish?" Her voice rose, trembling with a pain that was quickly hardening into anger. "I saw how they looked at me. Eli, I saw how you looked at nothing. You didn't even say my name. You let them think I was exactly what my stepfather said I was. You let me stand there in all that filth while you acted like I was just a stray dog you'd found on the road. So I'll ask you again. Are you ashamed to be seen with me?" He pulled the wagon to an abrupt halt in the middle of the vast, empty prairie. The only sound was the jingle of the harness and the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. He turned on the seat to face her, and his eyes were blazing with an emotion she had never seen before, a dark, fierce, possessive fire that stole her breath. He didn't answer with words. He reached for her, his hands hard on her arms, and pulled her from the wagon seat and down into the dust of the road. Before she could gasp, his mouth was on hers. This was not the desperate, fever-born kiss they had shared in the cabin. This was a kiss of raw, deliberate possession. It was a brand. It was an answer, a furious rebuttal to the town, to her stepfather, to her own doubts. He kissed her with a deep, punishing intensity, his arms wrapping around her like iron bands, crushing her against his hard body. He was pouring all of his frustration, all of his silent, bottled-up desire into this one savage act. And she, after a moment of stunned shock, met his fire with her own. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, and kissed him back with all the fury and longing in her own heart. The kiss went on and on, a wild, wordless battle on a lonely road under an unforgiving sky. It was a kiss that broke all the rules and burned all the bridges. When he finally lifted his head, they were both breathless, their chests heaving, their eyes locked. "Never," he growled, his voice a low, ragged rasp. "Never ask me that again." He lifted her back into the wagon as if she weighed nothing, and they drove the rest of the way home in a new, charged silence, the unspoken question now a deafening roar between them. That night, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. They ate their supper without speaking, the air crackling with the aftermath of that kiss. Every accidental brush of their hands was an electric shock. Every shared glance was a smoldering ember. After they had cleaned the dishes, Clara retreated to the porch, her heart a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She couldn't be in that small space with him. She couldn't lie on that lonely settee tonight. The moon rose, full and white, bathing the parched landscape in a soft, ethereal light. The night was warm, the air filled with the scent of dust and distant rain that never came. She heard the cabin door open and close behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was him. He came and stood beside her, not touching, just sharing the same small space of the porch, looking out at the silvered land. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice quiet. "Neither can I," she whispered. After a long silence, he said, "One of the horses is coughing. I should check on her." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. He walked down the porch steps and toward the dark, silent shape of the barn. Clara watched him go, and she knew she had a choice. She could stay here, safe in her solitude, or she could follow him into the shadows and face the fire he had promised. She stood, her legs trembling slightly, and followed him. The barn was filled with a soft, cathedral-like gloom, pierced by shafts of moonlight slanting through the gaps in the wooden slats. The air was warm and smelled of hay, leather, and the sweet, earthy scent of animals. The horses shifted in their stalls, their soft snorts and the stomp of a hoof the only sounds. He was standing in the center of the main aisle, his back to her. He had not been checking on a horse. He had been waiting. He turned as she entered, and his eyes found hers in the dim light. There were no more words to be said. They had been spoken in the dust of the road. She walked toward him, slowly, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm. He met her halfway, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. His eyes were dark with a mixture of raw hunger and a profound, aching vulnerability. This was not the hard, stoic man the world saw. This was the man who had lost everything, the man who had stared into the abyss of his own grief. And he was terrified. She could feel the tremor in his hands. She lifted a trembling hand and laid it over his heart, feeling its steady, powerful beat. In that one gesture, she gave him her answer. She was just as scared as he was, but her desire for him, her need for this connection, was stronger than her fear. His head lowered to hers, and he kissed her again. But this time it was different. There was no anger, only a deep, searching tenderness. It was a kiss of surrender. He swept her up into his arms and carried her up the ladder to the hayloft. He laid her down on a soft, deep bed of hay, the moonlight painting silver stripes across their bodies. He undid the pins in her hair, his fingers gentle, letting it spill across the hay like dark silk. He looked down at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated wonder, as if he were seeing a woman for the first time. The hay was soft against her back, its scent filling her senses. The world outside, the drought, the town, her past, all of it faded away, leaving only this space, this man, this singular, monumental moment. Their coming together was a quiet, desperate prayer. It was the tender, trembling exploration of two lonely souls who had forgotten the language of touch. It was clumsy and hesitant at first, then urgent and profound. For Clara, it was a reclaiming of her own body, a defiant act against the shame that had been forced upon her. In his arms, under his worshipful gaze, she was not a siren or a harlot. She was a woman, desirable and desired, powerful and beautiful. For Eli, it was an act of letting go, of allowing new life and warmth to finally enter the cold, shuttered rooms of his heart. It was the breaking of a long and lonely vigil. It was not the frantic coupling of lust, but the slow, deep merging of two halves of a shattered whole, finding solace and a fierce, unexpected joy in each other's arms. They were not a man and a woman. They were fire and fire, and in the heart of the barn, under the silent, watchful moon, they finally became one. Clara awoke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the slats of the barn. She was cocooned in warmth, her head resting on Eli's chest, his arms securely around her, his hand resting possessively on her hip. The steady, slow rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear was the most peaceful sound she had ever known. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt completely, utterly safe. She lay still, not wanting to wake him, memorizing the feel of his skin, the rough texture of his beard against her forehead. The fears and doubts of the past seemed like distant ghosts. Here, in the quiet morning, in the aftermath of their shared fire, everything felt simple. Everything felt right. His eyes opened, and he was looking at her, a soft, sleepy awareness in their gray depths. He didn't smile, but the hardness was gone from his face, replaced by a quiet tenderness that made her heart ache. He brushed a piece of hay from her hair. They lay in comfortable silence as the world outside began to wake up. The roosters crowed. The sky brightened, and the new day laid its responsibilities before them. The spell of the night was over, and the question of tomorrow hung between them. He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. His expression was serious now, his gaze direct and searching. He was a man who dealt in facts, not fantasies. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "If you want to leave, tell me now. I'll give you a horse and enough money to get you to St. Louis, or wherever you want to go. No one will ever have to know." He was giving her a choice. He was giving her freedom. He paused, his eyes holding hers, his soul laid bare in their depths. "If not, then stay." He took a breath. "Stay as my wife. Stay as my wife." The words, spoken in the quiet dawn of the barn, were not a question but a foundation stone, laid down in the dust and the hay and the soft morning light. Clara's answer was not spoken in words, either. It was in the way she leaned into his touch, the way her hand tightened in his. A silent, binding vow made between two souls who had found each other in the wilderness. Returning to the cabin was like stepping into a different world. The unspoken tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled intimacy, but the house itself was still a shrine to a ghost. Martha's presence lingered in the small, personal touches. A faded blue ribbon tied around a curtain, a set of porcelain teacups too delicate for this harsh life, and, of course, the silver-framed daguerreotype that held its lonely vigil on the mantelpiece. They both knew, without saying it, that their new life could not truly begin until they made space for it. The task began on a Sunday, a day they set aside from the relentless work of the farm. Eli brought down a large, dust-covered wooden trunk from the loft. He opened it, the hinges groaning in protest, revealing layers of folded linen and the faint, sad scent of lavender and disuse. "These were hers," he said, his voice quiet, matter-of-fact, though Clara could see the muscle twitching in his jaw. Clara approached the task with a gentle reverence, not the triumphant zeal of a usurper. She was not erasing Martha. She was helping Eli put his past to rest. She picked up a small, leather-bound book of poetry, its pages filled with a delicate, feminine script. She saw a piece of unfinished embroidery, a tangle of bright threads in the shape of a wildflower. These were not the belongings of a ghost. They were the remnants of a life, of a woman who had loved this man, this house. A strange sense of empathy washed over Clara. She felt a connection to this woman she had never known, a shared love for the difficult, silent man who now stood beside her. Eli worked silently, his movements stiff. He took the daguerreotype from the mantel. For a long moment, he just stared at the smiling, frozen face. his thumb tracing the silver frame. Clara held her breath, giving him the space he needed for his private farewell. Then, with a quiet finality, he wrapped the photograph in a piece of soft linen and placed it gently in the bottom of the trunk. It was an ending and a beginning. One by one, they packed the items away. The teacups, the ribbons, the delicate shawls. When they were finished, Eli closed the lid of the trunk, the sound a definitive click in the quiet room. He carried it back up to the loft, and when he returned, the house felt different. It was lighter. It was theirs. With the ghost of the past settled, Clara knew she had to face the monster of her present. She couldn't build a future with Eli while the shadow of Jedediah's lies hung over her. The title of thief and harlot was a brand on her soul, and she would not carry it into her marriage. "I have to clear my name," she told Eli that evening, her voice firm. "I won't be a wanted woman when I marry you." He nodded, his eyes filled with a grim respect. "What do you need?" "I need to write to the circuit judge," she said, "and I need someone of good character to speak for me. Someone who knew me before." There was only one person in redemption she could think of, Reverend Evans. He was an old man with kind, watery eyes who had christened her and had always been gentle with her mother. He had been a pastor in the town for 30 years and had seen its people at their best and their worst. The next day, they rode into town together. This time, there was a difference. Eli's hand rested on the small of her back as they walked. His presence was a solid, protective wall around her. The whispers still followed them, but they seemed to have less power. They found the Reverend tending the small garden behind his modest church. He looked up as they approached, his eyes widening in surprise. "Clara, my child, I had heard you were gone." "I am not gone. Reverend," Clara said, her voice clear and steady, "I am here to ask for your help to speak the truth." She told him everything, leaving out the most private details of Jedediah's advances, but laying bare the accusations, the lies, and her casting out. Eli stood a few feet away, a silent, intimidating sentinel, letting Clara fight her own battle. The old pastor listened patiently, his brow furrowed with concern. "I always found Jedediah Croft to be a man of loud piety," he said carefully when she had finished. "And I remember you, Clara, as a quiet, hard-working, and honest girl. Your mother was a good woman, though she was cowed by that man." He sighed, a weary sound. "A lie travels fast in a town like this, my child, but the truth has stronger legs. It just takes longer to finish the race. I will write a letter to Judge Abernathy on your behalf. I will attest to your character, and I will state for the record my doubts about Mr. Croft's sudden claims of theft, which only appeared after he had cast you from your home." Relief washed over Clara, so potent it almost made her knees buckle. It was the first time anyone in a position of authority had truly listened, had truly seen her. She spent the afternoon composing her own letter, her hand sure and steady. It was a simple, factual account, detailing her life with Jedediah and the circumstances under which she had been forced to leave. She did not sound like a victim. She sounded like a woman demanding justice. They left the two letters with Reverend Evans, who promised to send them with the next mail rider. The journey back to the farm was lighter, filled with a fragile, burgeoning hope. That hope was shattered a week later. It was late afternoon. Eli was out on the range, checking the fences. Clara was in her garden, humming softly as she pulled a few carrots from the earth for their supper. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, thinking it was Eli returning early. It was Jedediah. Her blood ran cold. He stood at the edge of her garden, a grotesque mockery of a concerned father. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a slick, false smile plastered on his face. He looked fatter than she remembered, his face ruddy with drink and self-satisfaction. "Clara, my girl," he said, his voice oozing a counterfeit sweetness that made her stomach turn. "There you are. I have been worried sick. I knew you hadn't stolen from me. I told the sheriff it was all a misunderstanding. I was just angry. You see, you know how a man's temper can get the better of him." She got to her feet slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The carrots were still clutched in her hand, the dirt cold and gritty against her skin. She said nothing. "I've come to take you home," he continued, taking a step closer. "Where you belong. We can put all this unpleasantness behind us. Your room is just as you left it." The image of that room, of him brushing past her in the narrow hall, of her mother turning her face to the wall, flashed in her mind. "This is my home now," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. His smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Don't be a fool, girl. You're living in sin with that hermit. What kind of life is that? The whole town is talking. You've shamed your mother's memory. Come home, and I'll speak to the Reverend. We'll have it all forgiven." "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Don't you take that tone with me," he snarled, the mask of civility dropping completely. He took another step, his hand reaching for her arm. "You'll do as I say." "She'll do nothing of the sort." The voice came from behind him, low and cold as a winter grave. Eli stood by the corner of the house, the Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. Its barrel pointed at the ground, but its presence a clear and deadly threat. His face was a thundercloud. Jedediah spun around, his face paling when he saw the rifle. He tried to puff out his chest, to regain his blustering authority. "This is a family matter. Stone, it has nothing to do with you. This girl is my responsibility." "She is not a girl," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet as he took a step forward. "And your responsibility ended the day you threw her out. Get off my land." "So, you can't threaten me. The law is on my side," Jedediah blustered, his eyes darting from Eli to Clara and back again. "She's a runaway. I'll have the sheriff out here." Eli raised the rifle an inch. "I'm going to tell you one last time. Get off my land, now." The air was thick with violence. Clara could see Eli's finger tighten on the trigger. She saw the raw, murderous rage in his eyes, the protective fury of a man ready to kill to defend what was his. And in that moment, she knew she couldn't let that happen. This was not his fight to finish. It was hers. "Eli, no," she said, her voice clear and strong. She stepped out of the garden, deliberately placing herself between the two men. She looked her stepfather directly in the eye, the fear that had ruled her life for so long finally burning away, leaving behind a core of pure, cold steel. "You have no power over me anymore," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. "I am not the little girl you could lock in her room. I am not the daughter you could shame into silence. I am not afraid of you." Jedediah stared at her, his mouth agape, stunned by her transformation. He saw not the timid, weeping girl he had cast out, but a woman, fierce and unbowed, her eyes blazing with the fire Eli had seen. "You will leave this place," Clara continued, her voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. "You will not come back. You will not speak my name again. If you do, I will be the one who goes to the sheriff. I will be the one who goes to the judge. And I will tell them everything. Do you understand me?" For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Jedediah's face contorted with rage and thwarted power. He looked from Clara's resolute face to the cold, deadly promise in Eli's eyes. He was beaten. "You'll regret this," he spat, venom in his voice. "Both of you. I'll be back. I'll be back with the law." He turned and stormed away, his retreat clumsy and undignified. They watched until his horse was a small, angry speck on the horizon. The rifle in Eli's hand slowly lowered. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, pride, and an overwhelming love. She was trembling, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her weak, but she stood tall. She had faced her demon and won. That night, as they sat by the fire, The threat of Jedediah's return hung in the air. "He'll do it," Eli said grimly. "He'll find a way to make trouble."
"I know,"
Clara whispered. "There's one way to protect you," Eli said, looking into the flames. "A way to make sure the law sees you as mine, not his, to give you the protection of my name." He turned to her, his hand covering hers. "We should get married. Clara, properly, as soon as the circuit judge comes through." It was a practical proposal, born of a threat, but it was also the deepest declaration of love he could make. He was offering her his name, his home, his life, a shield against the world.
"Yes,"
she said, her voice thick with emotion.
"Yes, Eli."
The circuit judge arrived 2 weeks later. The wedding was not what any young girl would dream of. There was no church, no crowd of well-wishers. The ceremony took place on the front porch of their cabin, officiated by the judge, a tired man who seemed more interested in the fee than the vows. Their only witnesses were a neighboring rancher and his wife, the quiet couple who had always nodded to Eli at the market fair and had never participated in the town's gossip. Clara had nothing to wear, but as she was searching for her plainest gray dress, Eli brought down a different trunk from the loft, one she hadn't seen before. Inside, carefully folded in layers of tissue paper, was a simple, elegant wedding dress of white lawn cotton, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "It was Martha's," he said quietly. "She never got to wear it. Her mother sent it, but it arrived after she was gone." He looked at Clara, his eyes full of a complex sorrow and a deep, present love. "I think she would want you to have it, to see it finally used to bring some happiness to this house." Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. She wore the dress of the woman whose ghost she had feared, not as a replacement, but as an inheritor. She was stepping into the role of wife on this ranch, continuing a story of love that had been tragically interrupted. It was a bridge between the past and the future. She stood on the porch, the worn wooden planks beneath her feet, the vast, unforgiving plains stretching out before her. She held Eli's rough, calloused hand, and she spoke the vows that legally and spiritually bound her to him. It was a simple ceremony, over in minutes, but as Eli leaned down and kissed her, his new and official wife, a quiet, profound joy settled in her heart. She was no longer Clara, the runaway. She was Mrs. Stone, a wife, a partner. She was home, as if the heavens themselves had sealed their union. The rains came. It started not with a gentle shower, but with a dramatic, violent thunderstorm that tore across the plains, the sky splitting open with a flash of lightning that illuminated the entire ranch in a stark, ghostly white. The thunder that followed was a deafening roar, a great cosmic throat-clearing after months of silence. Then came the rain, a solid, drenching, life-giving deluge. Clara and Eli stood on the porch, hand in hand, and simply watched. They didn't speak. They let the sound of it wash over them, a symphony of drumming on the tin roof, gurgling in the newly filled rain barrel, and a deep, thirsty sigh from the land itself. The scent of the rain hitting the parched earth was the sweetest perfume Clara had ever known. It was the smell of forgiveness, of second chances. The weeks that followed were a time of quiet, joyful resurrection. The land, so long brown and brittle, responded with an explosion of green. The creek began to run again, its voice a happy murmur. The cattle, their thirst finally slaked, grew fat and content. Clara's garden, which she had fought so hard to keep alive, now flourished with an almost indecent vibrancy. Autumn arrived, not as a season of dying, but as one of harvest and plenty. The days grew shorter, cooler, and the light took on a soft, golden quality. Their life fell into a new rhythm, one of peaceful, shared work and quiet, profound love. They were no longer two solitary people sharing a roof. They were a unit, a partnership, a family in its infancy. It was during this gentle season of renewal that Clara began to suspect a strange, pleasant weariness settled deep in her bones. and the smell of frying bacon in the morning, once a welcome aroma, now sent a wave of nausea through her. She kept her secret for a week, letting the fragile hope take root in her heart, terrified that even acknowledging it might make it disappear. One evening, they were sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and lavender. Eli was whittling a piece of wood, his calloused hands surprisingly deft, while Clara mended one of his shirts. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable, filled with unspoken affection. She put down her sewing, her hands going to rest on her still flat abdomen. She took a deep breath.
Eli,
She said, her voice barely a whisper.
I think I'm with child.
The knife in his hand stilled. He slowly looked up at her, his face unreadable in the twilight. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, and a cold dread began to creep into Clara's heart.
Was he angry? Disappointed? Was it too soon?
Then she saw it, a slow, wondrous light dawning in his stormy gray eyes, a look of such pure, unadulterated joy that it made her own heart ache. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his rugged features, making him look years younger. He reached out and gently laid his large, rough hand over hers on her belly, his touch as soft as a prayer.
A child,
he breathed, the word full of awe. Tears of relief and happiness welled in Clara's eyes. But beneath the joy, a darker, older fear stirred. The shadow of her past was long, and it reached even into this perfect, golden moment. Her smile faltered, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. Eli's smile vanished, replaced by a look of deep concern.
Clara,
What is it? Are you not happy?
oh yes,
She whispered, her voice thick with emotion.
I am. It's just,
She hesitated, the memory a bitter taste in her mouth.
I was with child once before.
Eli, a long time ago, before my mother got sick. He waited, his hand still warm and steady on hers, his gaze patient.
Jedediah,
She began, her voice cracking.
he was angry about something, a broken plate. I think
It was never about the plate.
he struck me in the belly with his fist.
The words were hard, shameful stones she had to force from her throat. I lost the baby the next day. My mother told me it was God's will, that it was for the best. She said a child born of a wanton girl would have been a curse. She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand the depth of her terror. I'm so afraid. Eli, I'm so afraid something will happen, that I'm not strong enough, that I am cursed. The look on Eli's face was terrible to behold. It was a cold, murderous fury, a rage so profound it seemed to darken the air around them. But it was not directed at her. It was for the man who had hurt her, for the mother who had failed her, for the past that had wounded her so deeply. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace fierce and protective. He held her tightly, rocking her gently as she sobbed against his chest, her old fears and new hopes mingling in a torrent of tears. Listen to me, he said, his voice a low, fierce growl against her hair. You are not cursed. You are the strongest person I have ever known. And nothing, do you hear me? Nothing is going to happen to this child. I won't let it. I will keep you both safe. I swear it on my life. And he did. From that day on, he treated her as if she were made of the most precious, fragile glass. He forbade her from lifting anything heavier than a skillet. He took over the milking and the hauling of water, tasks she had long since claimed as her own. He would watch her with an anxious, hawk-like intensity, his brow furrowed with worry if she so much as stumbled. His tenderness was a constant, gentle shield. He would rub her aching back in the evenings, talk quietly to the baby through her belly, and bring her wildflowers he'd found on the range. Their love, which had been forged in hardship and fire, now ripened in a season of quiet care and profound anticipation. They were a family, waiting for their future to arrive. The attack came without warning. In the dead of a moonless, starless night, Clara was jolted from a deep sleep by a strange, crackling sound and the smell of acrid smoke. She sat up, her heart pounding, her senses instantly on high alert. A sinister orange light was flickering against the bedroom window.
Eli!
She screamed, shaking him.
Eli, wake up!
He was awake instantly, his years of sleeping lightly on the range ingrained in him. He swung his legs out of bed, and in the same moment, the roar began. The hungry, terrifying roar of a fire devouring dry timber. He threw open the bedroom door, and they were met with a wall of heat and thick, black smoke. The main room of the cabin was an inferno.
Get out!
He yelled, his voice raw over the roar of the flames.
Go! Through the window!
Panic, cold and absolute, seized Clara, but Eli was a rock of calm in the chaos. He shoved her toward the small bedroom window, smashed the glass pane with his bare fist, and bundled her through the opening. She landed in the soft dirt of her garden, coughing and gasping for air. He was out a second later, his face grim, his hand bleeding from the broken glass. The roof of the cabin was wreathed in flames, spitting embers into the black sky. But a more terrible sight met their eyes. The fire wasn't just in the house, the barn, their livelihood, the shelter for their animals, was also ablaze. The flames leaping high into the night.
The horses!
Eli shouted, his face a mask of anguish.
The cow!
There was no time to think. They ran. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking blanket. Eli ripped open the main barn doors, and a wave of superheated air and panicked noise washed over them. The animals were screaming, their eyes wild with terror, trapped in their stalls. They worked with a desperate, frantic synergy. Eli, armed with an axe, began smashing the wooden latches of the stalls while Clara, her face covered with a piece of her nightgown, ran in after him, slapping and yelling at the terrified animals, driving them out into the relative safety of the open pasture. Smoke filled her lungs, burning and acrid. Her eyes streamed. Debris rained down from the hayloft, which was now a sea of fire. They got the horses out. They got the milk cow out. But one of the new calves was trapped, cowering in the back of a stall, too frightened to move.
Leave it!
Eli yelled, grabbing her arm.
The roof is going to go!
No, Clara cried, pulling away from him. The calf was a symbol of their future, of the new life on the ranch. She couldn't leave it to die. She darted back into the blinding smoke. She reached the calf, grabbing its halter, pulling and tugging, her voice a desperate, choked plea. The calf, finally spurred by her frantic energy, began to move. She guided it out of the stall just as a massive, burning beam crashed down from the loft, landing exactly where they had been standing seconds before. She stumbled out of the barn, half leading, half carrying the calf, her lungs on fire, her body shaking with exertion and terror. The world began to spin, the roaring of the fire and the screaming of the animals fading into a dull buzz. Black spots danced in her vision. The strength in her legs gave out, and she began to fall. Her last conscious thought a desperate prayer for the tiny, precious life inside her. She never hit the ground. Strong arms scooped her up, lifting her from the smoke and chaos. Eli, his face black with soot, his eyes wild with terror for her, held her tight against his chest. He ran with her, away from the inferno, his long strides eating up the ground until they were clear of the smoke, out in the cool, clean night air. He knelt in the grass, still holding her, rocking her, his voice a ragged litany of her name. Clara! Clara! Oh God! Clara! Her consciousness slowly returned. She coughed, a deep, racking sound, and drew in a shuddering breath of clean air. She was safe. The baby was safe. She was in his arms. And the memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. The dust storm, the road to redemption, the feeling of being lifted from the indifferent red dirt. A broken, Worthless thing. He had lifted her from the dust once before, a bundle of bones and rags he had taken on as a reluctant burden. Now, he lifted his wife, his world, the future growing within her, from a baptism of fire. The first time, he had saved her life. This time, he had saved their life. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears and soot from her cheeks. "Are you all right?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The baby." She placed a hand on her belly, a gesture of reassurance for both of them. "We're all right," she breathed. "We're safe." He buried his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with relief. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the grass. The terrified animals huddled nearby. They held on to each other as they watched their home, their past, and all their hard work burn to the ground, the flames consuming everything, until there was nothing left but the glowing, skeletal frame of the house silhouetted against the coming dawn. They had lost everything. But as Clara felt the steady beat of Eli's heart against her cheek and the faint, hopeful flutter of new life within her, she knew with an absolute certainty that they still had it all. The dawn that broke over the smoldering ruins of their home was cruelly beautiful. The sky was a tender, bruised purple, streaked with pink. The air was cold and sharp, still carrying the foul, chemical tang of burnt memories. They stood huddled together under a single blanket, the rescued calf tethered nearby, watching as the last of the angry red embers in the wreckage winked out, leaving behind a black, skeletal ruin. Everything they had built, everything they owned, was gone. It was a devastation so complete it should have been the end. But as Clara leaned against Eli's solid frame, her hand resting protectively on her belly where their future lay sleeping, she did not feel despair. She felt a strange, fierce clarity. The fire had taken the house, but it had also burned away the last of the ghosts. Martha's trunk, the old furniture, the very walls that had held Eli's grief for so long, all of it was gone. They were left with nothing but the land, their animals, and each other. It was a terrifying, absolute freedom. "We'll build it again," Eli said, his voice a low, rough thing in the quiet morning. It wasn't a question or a promise. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the man himself. They began that very day. Their first home was a crude lean-to built against a rock outcropping, a temporary shield against the elements. Their neighbors, the quiet couple who had witnessed their wedding, rode over that afternoon, their faces grim. They didn't offer pity. They offered help. They brought a tent, blankets, a cast-iron skillet, and a sack of potatoes. It was a gesture of such simple, profound decency that it brought tears to Clara's eyes. The work of rebuilding was a grueling epic written in sweat and muscle. Eli was a force of nature. He felled cottonwood trees from the creek bed, his axe ringing out from dawn until dusk. He squared the logs with an adze, his movements economical and powerful. He dug a new foundation and began hauling stones from the creek, his back and shoulders straining with the effort. He was not just building a house. He was fighting back against the chaos that had tried to destroy them, imposing order on the ashes one stone, one log at a time. Clara, despite Eli's protests, refused to be idle. Her pregnancy made her tire easily, but she worked with a fierce, quiet determination. She couldn't lift the heavy logs, but she could salvage. She spent days sifting through the cold, wet ashes of the cabin, her hands black with soot. She found a handful of her mother's silver buttons, miraculously untarnished. She found the melted, twisted remains of the plowshare Eli had given her, the symbol of her contract for survival. She found the iron head of a single hoe. With that one tool, she began her own act of resurrection. She cleared the scorched earth of her old garden, turning over the soil, her movements slow and deliberate. The neighboring rancher's wife had given her a small pouch of seeds, beans, corn, and hardy winter squash. Clara planted them, a new act of faith in a scarred landscape. Tending that small patch of earth became her daily ritual, a quiet insistence that life would and must go on. She was planting roots for the child who was growing within her. As they worked, something remarkable began to happen. The news of the fire and of their quiet, dogged refusal to be beaten by it spread through the territory. One day, the blacksmith from Redemption rode out with a wagon loaded with new tools, an axe, a hammer, a saw, and a box of nails. "On credit," he said gruffly, refusing to meet Eli's eyes. "Pay me when you can." A few days later, 2 more ranchers appeared, men Eli barely knew. They didn't say much. They just picked up axes and worked alongside him for a full day, setting logs into place. At dusk, they shared a simple meal of potatoes and coffee with Clara and Eli, and then rode off. The town that had once scorned her was now, in its own stoic, unspoken way, reaching out. They respected a fighter, and Clara and Eli, standing side by side against the ashes, were fighters. It was the mail rider who brought the news that would sever the final tie to her past. He arrived one afternoon, his horse lathered, and handed Eli a single, official-looking envelope addressed to Mrs. Clara Stone. Her new name, written in a stranger's hand, gave her a small thrill. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was a letter from the office of Judge Abernathy, her own letter, and the one from Reverend Evans had been received and reviewed. Jedediah Croft, upon being questioned by the sheriff under the judge's authority, and faced with a sworn statement from the town's most respected pastor, had confessed. He admitted there had been no theft. He admitted he had lied out of spite. The official charges against her were formally dismissed. She was a free woman, her name cleared in the eyes of the law. She read the letter twice, the words blurring through her tears. It was over. The weight she had carried for so long, the brand of thief, was finally, irrevocably gone. She looked up at Eli, who had been watching her, his face tense. She didn't have to say a word. He saw the relief, the radiant joy on her face, and he pulled her into his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around. He was laughing, a deep, rumbling sound of pure happiness that was more beautiful to her than any music. The house rose from the ashes, log by log. It was simpler than the first one, more rugged, built by their own hands. Eli built a stone fireplace, setting each rock with painstaking care. It drew beautifully, the fire a warm, steady heart in their new home. By the time the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, they were able to move in. It was not just a shelter, it was a fortress, a testament to their love and their resilience. Clara's time came as winter settled its cold, white blanket over the land. The labor was long and hard, a fierce battle that tested the limits of her strength. Eli was by her side the entire time. The large, rough man who had once been a stranger to tenderness was a pillar of unwavering support. He held her hand, wiped her brow with a cool cloth, and whispered words of love and encouragement, his voice a steady anchor in her sea of pain. He was not afraid of her cries, of the raw, primal reality of birth. He was simply there, a full partner in this final, most important act of creation. In the deep, quiet hours just before dawn, their son was born. He was small and perfect, with a shock of dark hair like his mother's, and a loud, healthy cry that filled the new cabin with a sound of pure, unadulterated life. Eli took the baby from the midwife's hands, his own hands, which could break a horse or build a house, trembling as he held his son for the first time. He looked down at the tiny, wrinkled face, and the last of the grief, the last of the solitude that had defined him for so long, simply melted away, replaced by a love so vast and powerful it was humbled him. He brought the baby to Clara, laying him gently in her arms. She looked down at her son, her heart overflowing. He was the product not of shame and violence, but of love and survival. He was the culmination of their entire journey. From the dust storm to the fire. From despair to this moment of perfect, quiet joy. "What will we name him?" Eli whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Clara looked from her son's face to her husband's, and she knew there was only one name that would do.
"Hope,"
she said.
"His name is Hope."
The years that followed were quiet and good. The ranch prospered, the town of redemption, having witnessed their resilience and the truth of Clara's character, finally, fully accepted them. The whispers died away, replaced by respectful nods and offers of friendship. They were no longer the town outcasts. They were the Stones, a family forged in fire, as tough and enduring as the land itself. The story ends on a warm summer evening, several years later. The house is sturdy and weathered, a home filled with the sounds of a small boy's laughter. The garden is a riot of color and life. They are sitting on the porch Eli built, a porch wide enough for a family. Little Hope, now a boisterous toddler with his father's gray eyes, is chasing fireflies in the yard, his giggles like tiny bells in the twilight. Clara is leaning her head against Eli's shoulder, her hand resting in his, their fingers intertwined. They are watching the sunset, a spectacular blaze of orange and crimson that sets the sky on fire. It is a peaceful, perfect moment, the kind of quiet happiness she once thought was impossible. Eli is quiet for a long time, watching his son, watching the sky. Then he speaks, his voice a low, wondering rumble. Not to her, but to the universe, to the ghosts of the past, to the winding, improbable path that had led him to this very spot.
"If I hadn't stopped for the dust that day,"
he says, his thumb stroking the back of her hand.
"If I had just driven on through, I would have missed my whole life."
Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. It's always a joy to see how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed this story, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts. Your support helps us keep these stories alive.